A very good morning to all of you. You may find that the passage that we read is somewhat disconnected because we jump from verse 24 to 35, okay, as though there's a missing part, okay. But there's a reason for doing that, okay. If you remember, 2 months ago on Mother's Day, okay, I spoke on that part that was missing, okay, and today we'll continue on with this part where hope hangs by a thread. You see, in life, we all face moments where hope seems to hang by a thread. It's devastating. When the doctor says to you, just prepare for the worst. We've done everything, and there's nothing more we can do. Or when we feel that our dream is dead. In fact, 26 years ago this month, my mom went to be with the Lord. And I want to thank Melody for that beautiful song because it struck in my chord, okay, the soul of my chord. I remember my mom was in the ICU after the surgery to remove the cancerous part of her colon, which was later after the biopsy showed that she had cancer. Okay. She was in the ICU for 5 days. And the 5th day, the doctor said to me, just prepare for the worst. Okay. Because her kidney is failing. Then followed by the liver and so on. And that evening, my mom went home to be with the Lord. And this passage that this morning that we want to focus on struck, I believe, in the hearts of many people. Okay, when sometimes doctors say to you they've done everything that they could, or when you feel like your dreams just come to an end, you just do not know how to go on. And in those desperate moments, our faith is tested, and it seems like all is lost. So this morning's passage, Mark actually paints a vivid picture of a crowd pressing in on Jesus. And in the midst of this jostling crowd, we find two desperate individuals. The one that we read just now is Jairus, a publicly prominent man seeking healing for his dying daughter. And the other, which I preached on 2 months ago, is a privately broken woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. Now, Mark is actually one of the most prolific gospel writers who uses a distinctive literary technique in which he begins with one story and then interrupts with another story, a second story, and then he returns to complete the first story. So the first story, he starts off, he says, Jairus begged Jesus to heal the dying daughter. And then he interrupts with the second story, where the bleeding woman who has been bleeding for 12 years, touched the edge of Jesus' cloak. Then after that healing of the bleeding woman, Mark went back to continue this first story by raising Jairus' daughter. And Bible scholars call this the Markan sandwich. Okay, so we took a look at the first part 2 months ago, the woman who is healed by touching Jesus' robe. And today we'll makan roti. Okay, 2 months ago we makan the beef. Okay, the good part on Mother's Day, and today we makan the roti. So I'll complete this story. Now these two stories are masterfully interwoven by Mark to teach us the profound truths about the nature of faith and Jesus' power over every form of brokenness. And this brings us to our first point, the desperate plea, from verses 21 to 24. Let's read together these few verses together. Jesus again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake. A large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. See, Mark, this passage here, describes Jairus, okay, as a man of religious and social standing, a public figure. And it tells us that he fell at the feet of Jesus, pleading for him to come quickly and place his hands on his little daughter who was at the point of death. So in this narrative, we take a look, we observe the following. Verse 22, Jairus' action and posture. Now, you must understand, Jairus is a very prominent synagogue ruler. Okay? Meaning to say, he is like what we in Malaysia maybe call Dato. Okay? Very prominent. And he risked his reputation. How? By falling at the feet of Jesus in submission. Then in verse 23, we take a look at the content of Jairus' plea. Very urgent, very humble, and very specific. He begs Jesus to lay his hands on his dying daughter. Like Jairus, we face maybe similar situations that often drives us to our knees. In our desperation, Jairus believes that Jesus must go and touch his daughter. He has not yet fully understand that Jesus' power actually transcends physical proximity. Jesus needs not go to Jairus' house. He can just speak, okay, and heal the daughter. Jairus at that time did not fully understand. He just said, "Jesus, please come to my house and lay your hands on my daughter." And talking about faith, I like to use this illustration. What is actually faith? And I use these two pictures. Okay, one is a broken wooden stool, and another one is a good wooden stool. Since Elaine is sitting here in front, I like to kacau her for a little while. Let's say, Elaine, you come to my house for our small group, and I offer you these two stools. Which one would you pick? The whole one. Which one? The one with lubang or what? Huh? Or the one on the right? Why? Oh, look more steady. Okay. But if I were to tell you, three-legged, no problem, you can still sit on it. Why? Because you got two more legs, right? So 3 plus 2, 5. Even better than 4 legs, right? Worst case scenario. Well, if that one doesn't hold you, worst case scenario is that you may just fall back, okay, and bump your head. Hopefully nothing serious happens. But I want us to understand, faith will always involve an object. The question is the object of your faith trustworthy? Faith will always involve an object. We say, I have faith or I have trust that money buys everything. But does money really buy everything? You can have money, but have no health. Money, wealth, okay? And then you say, well, I believe in power and position, okay? Because that's what will carry me through. I send command and people listen. Okay? Take a look at our ex-Prime Minister. Wealth and position. What happens to him? Lands him in jail. You say, well, you see, I need us to understand that faith will always involve an object. The question is whether the object of your faith is trustworthy. When you take a look at these two stools, remember this. Which one is trustworthy? And what is faith? Someone puts it this way. However big or small is your faith, it only matters as long as the object of your faith is in Christ alone. And someone used this acronym, faith, F-A-I-T-H, meaning forsaking all, even all other religions, I choose to only trust Him. Faith in Christ alone. See, Jairus believes that Jesus must go and touch his daughter. He has not fully understand that Jesus' power actually transcends that physical proximity. His faith, however imperfect, brings him to the right person. And we often think that our faith must be complete in order for it to be valid. But I want to say this to you, that this is not so. Because however desperate, however shaky, however status shattering our faith is, if the object of our faith is in Jesus and Him alone, there That is all it matters. That is all it matters. Jairus' faith does not rest on a formula or a sign. Rather, it rested on Jesus Christ alone. This brings us to our second point, the delay that tests faith. Let's read Mark chapter 5 verse 35 together. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came to the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" See, unfortunately, this delay was interrupted, as I mentioned earlier, by another unseen story within this main story. That is the healing of a bleeding woman, seemed to have cost the life of Jairus' daughter. We learn that after the miraculous healing incident of this bleeding woman, some messengers came and bluntly declared in verse 35, "Your daughter is dead. You don't need a doctor anymore. Now you need a caretaker to take care of the body." Okay. Why bother the teacher anymore? See, whatever hope that hangs by a thread is now totally crushed by this devastating news. From a human perspective, the interruption has been very catastrophic to Jairus. And Jairus must have wondered, if only my daughter would have lived, if only this bleeding woman hasn't delayed Jesus from coming to my house. Instead of a healing, Jairus is now faced with the reality of making funeral arrangement. Can you imagine the world's verdict where it says it's too late, caused by the interruption, where no one has control over the situation? How do we respond? From the human perspective, the interruption feels catastrophic. If only the bleeding woman hasn't delayed Jesus from coming. How do we respond to God's timing when it conflicts with ours? Delays and interruptions can feel like divine neglect. But let me say, it is actually God's divine appointment, because our faith is tested when God seems late in those situations. Our faith is tested. Do we still dare to trust in His timing? This brings us to the third point, the response to hopelessness. Let's read together Mark chapter 5 verse 36 to 40 together. Ignoring what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him and put him out. He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. See, I want us to understand from this picture, Jesus actually redefines the disastrous situation. When Jesus overhears and responds to the news of death with this command, he says to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." Before Jairus can even speak any further. And the message from the household, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother with the teacher anymore?" You see, that message itself was designed to make Jairus actually to give up his hope. However, we discover that the delay here was very intentional and also literal. Why? Because according to Judaism, touching a corpse, a dead body, okay, renders a person ritually unclean. And so for a synagogue ruler, a religious leader, asking a rabbi to come and touch a dead body, okay, is unthinkable. But notice earlier in the story about the bleeding woman, okay, Jesus was untainted even by that bleeding woman who touched the edge of his cloak. Because touching someone, a woman who has been bleeding, is also unclean. And here we see Jesus redefining holiness, because his purity is so strong, so powerful, that it heals. Ignoring what they said, Jesus immediately counters by saying to Jairus in verse 36, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Now, ignoring what they said in verse 36 is very important, because it represents a conscious decision to reject despair, fear, and human logic in favor of trusting in Jesus' power and authority. In addition, we know that negative report can cause doubt and depression, hindering our faith in God. So ignoring those voices helps us to maintain our focus on God's promises. Friends, our faith in God's promises will counteract our fear and hopelessness. Verse 37 says that Jesus did not let anyone follow except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, into the room, because these were the three closest disciples who will later witness Jesus' transfiguration at Mount Sinai, and also Jesus' Garden Gethsemane struggle. Verse 38 tells us about the contrasting perspective. Verse 38 recorded that when they came to Jairus' home, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. This commotion of crying and wailing by what we call professional mourners confirms that the little girl is already dead. And I know what wailing is like. When my father passed away when I was 14 years old, almost the whole town of Tampin can hear loud crying in my home. Okay? Especially when the eldest and the second daughter-in-laws were crying so loudly just to show how they love my father. Chinese, when people die, they cry very loud one, right? Except Christian funeral, I don't know. Maybe Christian funeral is different. Okay. The noise of these professional mourners sharply contrasted Jesus' later declaration in verse 39. Your child is not dead, but asleep. It triggers this immediate mocking laughter in verse 40. It's just like, the Cantonese will say, 真係好慘啊！12歲已經死咗啦。Can you imagine that? 未到12歲死咗啦，真係好慘啊！ And Jesus said, 佢冇死啊，佢瞓覺啫啊。See, you are laughing, right? Because that's what the world is saying. The world says dead, but Jesus says asleep. And this triggers mocking. And the only way to remove these mocking voices is actually to have faith in Jesus and Him alone. So by removing these people, Jesus removed these people, it validates the girl's death in verse 40, because Jesus highlights the necessity of faith in Him for miracles. And this brings us to our last point, the power over death. Let's read Mark chapter 5, verse 41 to 43. Together, let's read. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At first they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. Now verse 41 and 42, Jesus, remember the girl is dead, and Jesus took her hand. That means Jesus actually touched a dead body. Okay? As I mentioned, according to Judaism, touching a dead corpse is actually, it renders a person unclean. Okay? And Jesus took the little girl's hand and say, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. And immediately, what happened? The girl stood up and started walking around, just like any, not girls only, but also boys would do. And it's interesting. The verse says she was 12 years old. Now, if you are a very good, observant Bible student, you notice about the 12 years old girl and the woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. I'll come back to that later. Now here Jesus' words in Aramaic is very personal. Little girl, get up. Very personal, tender, and authoritative. He also breaks this ceremonial uncleanness by touching the dead body. And it is, as I have said, very interesting to note that the text emphasizes her age, which connects to the woman's 12 years of suffering, of bleeding. So immediately this little girl gets up and walks around. Remember, she is not resuscitated. She is resurrected. There's a difference, huh? She is not resuscitated. That's why those people were crying out loudly. They know that this little girl is already dead. Okay? So she is resurrected and restored to full bodily function by Jesus' authoritative command. And then Jesus gave two strange commands. Tell no one, and gave her something to eat. Tell no one, because the miracle points to Jesus as He is the resurrection and the life, and gave her something to eat. This is the practical proof that she has been physically restored to life. Jesus' offer is not just a restoration of a broken life by death, but also it is an entrance into His new creation by resurrection. Now, I want to compare these two stories. Okay? The one that I preached 2 months ago about the bleeding woman, and also today, Jairus' dying daughter. If you take a look, okay, Jairus, his social religious status, he's of high status, a very prominent ruler of the synagogue. Okay, the bleeding woman, low status, a social and religious outcast due to her condition. She has been bleeding. Can you imagine, okay, woman having, the monthly menopause, okay? This, for women bleeding every month, is just only a few days, but this lasted for 12 years. Financial condition, this guy Jairus is very wealthy, influential, and respected in the community. The bleeding woman, she's impoverished because she has spent all her money for her medical treatment, but it only grew worse. The nature of the crisis for the Jairus' daughter, it's an acute emergency. The daughter was at the point of death. But for the bleeding woman, this is a very chronic, long-term affliction. She suffered for 12 years. Number, very important. That's why I say number 12 is very important, because the daughter enjoyed 12 years of life before facing death, whereas the woman endured 12 years of suffering and living death. Purity status, Jairus' daughter is clean, but risk becoming ritually unclean, okay, by the touching of the dead daughter. For the bleeding woman, chronically ritually unclean under the Levitical law, anyone who touched her becomes unclean. The approach to Jesus, I want us to see the difference. For Jairus, he's a public figure and he's very public, very direct. He goes to Jesus straight away. He approached Jesus openly in front of the crowd and fell at his feet. But for the woman, it's very secretive, okay? Very indirect. She slipped through the crowd from behind and touched the hem of the garment. Jesus' response, Jesus' response, Jesus immediately went with Jairus without requiring a public confession first. For the bleeding woman, Jesus stopped at the crowd to bring her into the open, calling her daughter and validating her faith. The delay factor for Jairus, the woman's healing delayed Jesus from coming to Jairus' home, resulting in the news of Jairus' daughter had died. The bleeding woman, her faith and healing served as a living object lesson to sustain Jairus' faith during the delay. The ultimate outcome, the daughter was raised from the dead, restored to the family. And for the bleeding woman, she was instantly healed and socially restored. She was told to go in peace. So in conclusion, and what's the application for us? The big idea is this: Jesus may not prevent any crisis in our life. But I want you to understand this: Jesus will always be present in those crises and speaking life to whatever desperation you are facing. So 4 practical applications here. When you feel interrupted, whatever crisis it is, remember this: the delays are always God's divine appointment. It is to show you, continue to hear what Jesus says. Don't be afraid. Just believe. And when bad news arrives, remember this: Jesus is never late, because Jesus is never in a hurry. He will always be on time. And when people mock at your hope, remember this: follow Jesus past those mockers. You remember, we are not called to silence those mockers, but we are called to follow Jesus past those mockers. When you need a touch, remember this: Jesus reaches across your brokenness and takes you by your hand and leads you on. So church, what dead situation are you facing today? Is it a dead dream? A dead relationship? A dead hope? Remember always to hear what Jesus said: don't be afraid. Just believe. Because Jesus is not limited by our human timetables. Why? It's because Jesus specializes in resurrection. So come to Him in your desperate faith. Trust in His timing. See from His perspective and watch Him bring life where there is death. Let us pray.